Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Super excited to have an extraordinarily special guest here that uh, crosses between politics and business and startups and family offices and private markets. David Sawyer, who is the co-founder and CEO of Unlimited AI. He's an active investor, former managing partner, and chief operating officer of Legacy Knight, a multifamily office. And he's also been integral in running many political campaigns. So we'll get into that. David, welcome to the show. Super excited to have you here.
Thanks, Kip. It's fantastic to be with you. Really, really grateful to be on with you today.
No, awesome. Well, yeah, I usually kind of start with origin story, kind of comic
Sure.
book episode one. So if you would, let us know who David Sawyer is and how you came to be doing what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I'm a native Texan. I grew up behind the Pine Curtain in East Texas, Longview, Texas, and probably the only really notable thing about Longview, there are a couple, but it's the hometown of Matthew McConaughey. So I think most people know
Yes.
Longview through that. So I grew up in East Texas. Great place to grow up. Really down to earth people, and so enjoyed that. And then I went to the University of Texas, and so diehard Longhorn. And then from there went to the University of Houston Law School. Last night was disappointing with the Cougs,
Yeah.
almost barely missing a national championship. But so I've been a Houstonian for the last almost 20 years now. So my story led me here. I think Houston's a great entrepreneurial city, and love living here. People come from all over the world. It's a great place of opportunity, and I think that stems obviously from the energy industry. But I think broadly, it's an underrated entrepreneurial city, and so I've been here a long time and happy to be building a company here today. But my story when I was at the University of Texas, I was really into politics. I thought it was just the most interesting, exciting place to be. And so obviously I worked at the Capitol. I was going to graduate early from college. And so instead I took a semester off to work a legislative session, and I caught the political bug really early on. And so spent many years in that world, and then realized that that wasn't as fun as building businesses. And, I had to pay off my law school loan
Right.
somehow. And so ended up transitioning into business and building private investment firms about 10 years ago.
No, very, very good.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, maybe tell us a little bit about Unlimited AI and
sure.
what exactly it is.
Yeah, so I'll start with why I want to solve this problem and how we got here. So, like I said, the past 10 years, what I've been doing in the alternative investment space, when I say, by the way, let me define that real quick for everybody. When I say alternative investments, I mean private equity, private credit, venture capital, real estate, anything that's not stocks and bonds, the private markets. And, historically, the private markets have been the province of large endowments, pensions, mega family offices, and that's ultimately who is the investor base, right? And what's dramatically shifted, and it really started about 10 years ago. I was lucky enough to be early in on that curve. Is it is proliferated into the kind of broader individual investor world. So I'll define that as family offices and high net worth individuals.
Hmm.
And to invest in private funds, you have to at least be an accredited investor. And most funds, you have to be a qualified purchaser,
Hmm.
meaning you have to have 5 million investable assets. So these are still people with a fair amount of assets, but that audience was historically very underallocated to the private markets. And the difference, though, between individual investors and institutional investors is that the institutions have lawyers and accountants and big staffs and a lot of resources around them to help manage them. Because private investments aren't like public investments. You can't log into your Fidelity account and just click buy, and then you've got this great trail. You know where the cash came from. You know what your basis is and things like that. Private markets are much more siloed, much more manual. Lots of PDFs. To subscribe to a fund, to buy an interest in a fund, you're signing a 60-page subscription
Hmm.
document. You've got a 90, 100-page LPA, limited partnership agreement that, some New York lawyers drafted up, and it's got, very complex legalese in it. And so, what's happened is, as individual investors gotten into this space, they're at a dramatic asymmetry from an informational standpoint and a power standpoint against the GPs, the private equity firms, private credit firms, venture capitalists. And so the complexity problem in private markets is really dramatic. And so at Legacy Knight, my prior firm, we were running family offices for a small group of ultra high net worth individuals, typically tech founders who had exits. And then we also sponsored our own investments that we would syndicate to this audience. And
Okay.
over time, I watched, years and years and years of these individuals really struggle to understand their data, to understand their obligations from a capital commitment standpoint. In the private markets, it's not like a stock where you just buy it and you fund it. A lot of times funds have drawdowns, so you may be funding that commitment over 5 years. Sometimes they call all of it over time, sometimes they don't. And so it's a complex experience, and people have really struggled with that. And historically, the way you manage that was through hiring a bunch of accountants and lawyers and staff to do
Uh-huh.
that, and that's expensive. And we did that for families, of course, at LK. But what's dramatically changed, what the real inflection point has been in the private markets is AI now can do a lot of that for you.
Mm.
And it's still not 100% automated. It can't be, but what we're going to do at Unlimited AI, what we're building today is effectively harnessing AI to empower these individuals to manage and have full oversight and control over their private investment portfolios. And so what that means is when you get all these manual documents in your inbox, you get a capital call, you get distributions, you have lengthy legal documents, we're actually going to digitize that for you and give you a unified platform from which to view and manage and interact with all of that data. And that's really never been available to investors before.
Very good. So
Yeah.
here's the question. You just mentioned like the LP agreement
Mhm.
and the other agreements that normally have, teams of lawyers looking at how, and this may depend from opportunity to opportunity, how flexible are those documents? Or are they usually set in stone and like you don't have a lot of negotiation within those documents?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and this is something I've been worked on a lot in my career. The the short answer is it depends on how much capital you're willing to put in and how prestigious of a LP you
Sure.
might be. And so the reality is most family offices, individual investors have very little to no leverage
Right.
because they're committing smaller amounts. And in my career, when I started in this game, most private funds they had usually a $5 or $10 million minimum investment amount, which was far too high for most individuals. And how that shifted over time is now those have gone down. There are tech platforms that allow access to these funds and things. But in the past, what we would do is, I would go say to a private equity manager and I'd say, hey, I know your minimum's 10 million. How about we'll put in 50 and you give us a fee break or maybe we get co-investment rights. And then us with our team, we would, negotiate breaks, we would negotiate various things in the LPA. And then I would create my own vehicle and I would
Mm.
let family office individuals come through me like a feeder structure.
Sure.
And by, negotiating the fees or providing co-investment rights or things like that, which we can talk about that in a minute, I would give effectively as good or close to as good of the same terms and economics to those individual investors who could then come into my vehicle, let's say $250,000, as those big institutional investors. And so I've always been passionate about helping, the proverbial little guy in the private markets get the same access and the same sophistication in their private portfolios as the big, pensions, endowments, and insurance companies and folks like that. And so yeah, so it is complex. They are difficult. It is hard to negotiate. And in today's world, that's still the case. And like I said, I think one of the challenges is resources, and another is transparency, right? It's just small investors they don't have the resources to understand a lot of these things. If you're committing 250,000 to a fund, you're not going to pay an expensive securities or corporate attorney, $50,000 in legal fees
Uh-huh.
to review those documents and negotiate it with a GP. You're just not going to do it. And candidly, the GP would say, we don't need your money as much. So it is a problem. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a very distinct power asymmetry between LP and GP, particularly as it relates to individual investors. And I'm very passionate about solving that.
Uh-huh. No, I can tell. How
Yeah.
about, I know you spent some time before Legacy with Kaz,
Hmm.
and of course they became famous with the book with Tony Robbins and so
Yeah.
forth. But was that part of their strategy? Maybe it wasn't until the book, but to get more smaller investors involved and making more incremental investments into private equity and private markets, or what was your experience at Kaz?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm proud of what we accomplished at CAS. When I joined that firm, it had less than 500 million of AUM, and I think it's at 7 billion or so today. So it had been around a long time, but the business model had shifted, and so we had shifted towards the model I was talking about, where we would try to democratize private investments to the audience of family offices, high net worth individuals, and so that was the audience there. We had a great run. I learned a lot about private markets investing. That's where I really got interested in software companies and venture capital.
Okay.
When I got out of the political world and I went there, I was instantly drawn to that world because I love the velocity of it.
Uh-huh.
I loved how fast people were moving. I love the growth. I'm very grateful that's where I got to learn a lot about investing in software and tech companies, and so started there. That was what I led there. I covered tech and software, and we made some fun investments at the time when I was there. And then ultimately in 2020, one of my investors there, he reached out and was forming Legacy Night and asked me to
Okay.
come join and be his co-managing partner with him, and that's how I got to Legacy Night. But yeah,
Okay.
Kaz is a great marketing firm. They hit a curve early on, which was the growth of individuals in the private markets, and obviously have had a lot of success doing that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah,
And then you touched on unlimited AI. So it's
sure,
it's creating a platform we can take all the information and make it maybe explain a little further on
sure,
what
sure,
what
sure.
exactly unlimited AI
Yeah.
does.
Well, so I'll start again. Let me explain the complexity problem really, really simply for you.
Yeah.
So, if you're a family office and you have 50 private investments, and say they're in funds. That means that you've got capital calls coming, meaning the managers are actually calling, asking you to fund portions of your commitment. It's not all at once. You may be getting distributions of capital from some managers. You have lengthy legal documents for every vehicle. They have different investment periods for different funds. There are various different terms. You have quarterly statements that come in. Sometimes you have monthly statements. It depends. You have a lot of paperwork coming your way, and it's all in unstructured data in PDFs by and
Yeah.
large. And so a lot of times now they're in portals, so they're not just emailing you a PDF like they used to, although a lot of
Uh-huh.
managers still do. And so if you're an individual, you're effectively taking this data, you're either printing it or you're looking in your document and you're porting it to a spreadsheet. And it's a very time-consuming manual process. And that is shockingly for an industry that is just trillions of dollars today, that is how most private markets investors outside of the largest institutions manage their data and manage their portfolios. And so at Unlimited, a lot of now today, you can use AI to read those documents.
Hmm.
You can use AI to pull that data out of those documents and put them in a digital format. And obviously, depending on how you structure it, I won't get too in the weeds on AI and how we're using it for this audience, but effectively, you're able to automate those processes or come very close to automating those processes. And then beyond that, because again, if you're looking at your spreadsheet here, you have to go reference documents to go find what something is. You don't have any reference data that's at your fingertips to actually go find that data. We'll have an interactive LLM. It's called Unlimited Insights, where you can engage with your data. You can ask questions of your data. You can, ask about your performance several years ago. You can ask about that
Huh.
capital call that happened last year that you forgot, how much it was for and things like that. So actually being able to interact with your data instead of just being a passive
Yes.
consumer of data, I think is really powerful. And so that's our mission. And ultimately, what we want to do here is really just empower those individual investors. And so, when they pull up their private markets portfolio on unlimited.ai, they're able to see the whole universe, see everything they've done, those 10 emails of capital calls and statements and everything else that hit their inbox that week. They don't have to go drag those out. They don't have to go log into a portal and download them and then port the data. It's already there. And so that's our goal. And you can now use agentic AI to do so many of those tasks for you. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do and automate for these investors.
No, that's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, last thing is the individual and family office segment of investors is the fastest growing segment in private markets. Unquestionably, the biggest trend in the private markets today is more high net worth and more individual investors and more funds. And so all the big GPs, KKR, Blackstone, BlackRock, everyone wants more individuals. They call them retail investors. I think that's
Uh-huh.
a misnomer, but the individuals, they want more of that in their portfolios. And so obviously we're trying to build at this trend where people really have a problem here and they need help, but that audience is also proliferating dramatically. And so
Hmm.
we think it's going to be a massive audience over time. It's going to be arguably the most important audience in the private markets in 10 years. And we want to be the platform that everyone builds that on top of.
Yeah. Why do they want more individual investors? Is it just to diversify their investor
Yeah, that's a great
group or
question.
yeah.
So, you know, 25 years ago, most endowments and institutions, they had very little exposure to alternatives. And a guy named David Swinson at Yale was really the innovator here, and is an icon of the private markets world. But at Yale, they started upgrading and doing a ton more alternatives in their portfolios. So Yale at one point, I think, was close to
Huh.
50% privates in their portfolio. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, endowments and pensions have long-term, outlays. They have long-term windows of investment harvesting. Obviously, they need cash flows depending on the university to fund, various activities at the university in the endowment world. But by and large, they have a longer period that they can invest. And so those 10-year funds that have a lot lower volatility, but arguably better returns over time historically, that's very attractive. And so that caused this huge wave of pensions, endowments, insurance. They funded the first real wave of private equity growth. And so the
Okay.
industry has boomed pretty dramatically from that audience. What's happened though is the adoption growth of that audience has plateaued.
Okay.
And so, for example, Texas teachers retirement system is never going to go from 30% alts to 80% alts, right? It's going to plateau out at 30, 40% max. And so as a result, the big players, the largely public players, KKR, Blackstone, Blue Owl, all the others, they're looking for their next audience to go grow in. And oh, by the way, this massive individual audience, and if you really get down to the retail level, you're talking about people who have 401ks, IRAs, really long-term capital that they're not going to touch for 40 years. It's
Yes.
actually a perfect match of obligations, liabilities with the investment strategy. And so I think the industry is right to target this audience. However, no one is solving the problem of how do these people manage that,
Mm.
right? And so the reason why they've trended again is because it's the biggest growth trend. All the managers see this as the biggest untapped audience. On average, most individual investors have something like 5% of their portfolios in alts. And that's by and large real estate. They're
Hmm.
they're either owning their home, maybe they own a little bit of other real estate. But there's a real opportunity for the industry there. And I think ultimately, even though we are unapologetically pro LP, like our job, that's why we're called Unlimited. We're
Right.
trying to empower the limited partner. I think by providing better transparency, by providing more insights, by allowing individual investors to have a better grasp over their private investments, I think that helps the GP too, because people are going to be more inclined to want to invest in these asset classes when it's not a total black box to them.
Right. Oh, very good.
Yeah.
And before we hopped on here, you were talking about just building businesses is building culture and core
Mhm.
values and people. So maybe chat a little bit about your philosophy around that in unlimited AI or anything
Sure.
else.
Yeah, well, I'm probably the thing I'm most excited about Unlimited. I think we have a really good market. I think we have the experience to win in this market, but ultimately you have to have the right team. I'm thrilled to have the team we do at Unlimited so far. But people are everything.
Mm.
Every business is a people business, just like every business is a marketing business. We I think that integrity has to be first. And that's not just externally, but internally as well. I'm stubborn. I've got great role models. My dad, my father-in-law, they're great business people. My father's physician, but they operate the right way. They have kindness every day. They treat others with respect. And I think that is absolutely critical. I think you can win by doing it the right way because I've seen it done. And I think for me as an entrepreneur, I think I have a duty to do the same. And in our culture, unfortunately, I think people, they look at what they see in the world and they mimic it. And so every generation is going to look at the businessmen that are 30 or businesswomen as well that are 20, 30 years above them and see how they operate and how they find success. And ultimately, I think the more people you see doing it the right way, the more younger people will be inspired to do it that way too. And so I feel a sense of responsibility for us to do it that way. And because I've been able to watch others do it that way too. And I think you create a cycle. And so, I'm very stubborn about
Huh.
that. I think it's important. I won't tell you. We have a no. Our policy at Unlimited is, well, you can bleep me out, but
You
we have
can
a no
no, you
hassle
can say it.
policy. Yeah. So, and I'm very very firm on that. I think there are a lot of people out in the world you can do business with, and you have to choose who you want to operate with. And so that's important. But to me, high integrity in your operations means show up to work every day and do the work. But it also means, be kind to others, but be transparent and honest with others. To be unclear is to be unkind. And so I
Mm.
think it does mean you need to be honest and have candid conversations with your team. And, that prevents a lot of the cultural issues that can come up in businesses around, resentment, passive aggression, things like that. If you just have honest conversations and you have a culture where people can sit down and talk honestly about their frustrations, their problems, their challenges, and understand we're all on the same team against the problem. And so, yeah, I'm passionate about that, and I'm excited for the opportunity to build that at Unlimited.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
How about you touched on this here, but just your personal definition of leadership and maybe how that's evolved over time and as you've grown out throughout your career.
sure. I firmly believe in servant leadership,
Mm.
and you can find that a lot of ways. But at the end of the day, if you're not living the way you expect your team to live and you don't operate the way you expect your team to operate, they're not going to follow you. And so I think as a leader on a high quality, really talented team, especially, I think that you have to understand that when you recruit a team of A players, they have a lot of opportunities
Hmm.
and they have a lot of ability to move. They can go start their own companies. They can be leaders. And if you want them to be on your team and help build what you're, building towards, then you have to create the environment for them to thrive in that. And so I think when you bring people on, you have an obligation and a duty to them to be the leader they need to give them what they need to operate and succeed and thrive in your company too. And I think too often leaders they view employees as people to extract value from,
Hmm.
and I just don't see it that way. I think ultimately, unlimited is my dream. It's
Uh-huh.
what I want to build. It's me living my entrepreneurial dreams, and they're helping me do that every day. And so I think that by making sure you have the right environment and making sure you're doing the same work they are and you're being the leader that they need every day, not every day. We're not perfect. I don't expect people to be perfect, but I think ultimately that sets the standard in a company. And so to me, it all starts there as a servant leader. But also, I think, you know, again, leading with integrity, the way you operate, the way you treat customers, the way you treat service providers, ultimately is going to, trickle down into the rest of your company. But to me, the core, we're still a small team because we just launched, 6 months ago. But
Yeah.
to me, I tell my team all the time, it's not me that's going to protect the culture we create. It's you. Because
Uh-huh.
as we scale, as we layer, you're going to make the next hire, and they're going to make the next hire, and they're going to make the next hire. And if you don't keep the standards high and you don't make sure that we have the right people that want to win the right way and have high integrity every day, then ultimately, that's going to affect our culture down the line. And so I think it's critical not just for me to set the standard, but it's for my leadership team to set the standard too.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been your approach so far in attracting A players or just high performance leaders within Unlimited?
Sure. You know, I think any leader you have to set the vision, right? And
Hmm.
you have to make sure that people understand the big picture as to why you're doing what you're doing. And ultimately, again, you're asking them to make a big decision in their life. You're asking them to give you their time, which is critical. And so I think when you sit down with someone, it's what is the vision? How is this going to be big? And ultimately, you're also selling yourself. How am I committed? And thankfully, my leadership team, most of them have worked with me before or
Uh-huh.
worked for me before. And so I take it as a big compliment. They were willing to do it again. My co-founder, Hunter, is brilliant. He worked for me at Kaz. He was a really brilliant young guy. He's much more technical than I am. But ultimately, the funny thing with him is he was an easy sell because when I called him and told him I had this idea, and I'm not kidding, I had the name and I had an idea, and I told him I wanted to build, and he said, "Hold on, I'm going to send you a deck I've been working on," and it was 80% the same idea. And so I'm not kidding. It was a
Wow.
providential moment. And so Hunter and I, it was just like a light bulb, and we had to do it together. And so he was easy. Beyond that, again, it was really selling what our vision was and the kind of company we wanted to build, and obviously the track record of what we've done in the past. And thankfully that's worked pretty well so far.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
And what's been your approach to having people join or use Unlimited? I mean, are you going after family offices, high
Yeah.
net worth? I mean, how are you approaching that to grow the
Sure.
business?
Yeah, and to be clear, so our product is in beta mode right now, and
Mm.
so we'll have our formal launch sometime midsummer.
Okay.
But I'm thankful to have worked with well over 1,000 LPs in the last 10 years that were family offices, high net worth individuals, and That's my first audience. Those are our first customers. And so, we've already been talking with a lot of them, working through these problems. And, again, every time I have one of these conversations and I talk to an entrepreneur or I talk to a, family office and they just, lament the problems, they show me the spreadsheet, they talk about the hours and hours of time they spend doing these manual tasks, the more emboldened I am to build
Yes.
something to solve that. And the interesting thing too, I'll say this too. I love entrepreneurs. I think watching someone live their dreams is the most wonderful thing in the world. I
Uh-huh.
love cheering people on when they're building great things. And what I found is the audience that we tend to go to, whether it's family offices or whether it's individuals, they tend to have a pretty strong entrepreneurial bent.
Right.
And the reason why is because an insight that I've learned over the years is say it's a doctor or a lawyer or someone like that that's had a lot of success, but they didn't build their own thing. They didn't control necessarily. I mean, some do, but they're totally okay outsourcing that to a wealth manager. But I find most entrepreneurs who are used to building their own life, they have high agency, they're used to having control over their processes, over their everything, their life. They tend to want to manage their own things. And
Uh-huh.
so that's the audience I think our product is really built for, because those are the people who want to manage it. They want to be doing these investments, but ultimately they have a lot of complexity that they need help with. And so that's who our audience is, and that's who we're working for. And I consider that a real privilege to get to work with really inspiring people every day like that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Any since the launch, new trends or new opportunities
Mhm.
other than the big one that you've described that made
Sure.
you decide to launch Unlimited, but any future trends, opportunities that you're seeing that you're most excited about, and then how are you positioning Unlimited to take advantage there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think I sent our team an email on Sunday. Obviously, you have a lot of noise in the markets right now, Thursday and Friday, absolute bloodbath with the tariff news. And I sent an email to our team that was just titled Building Through Uncertainty.
Uh-huh.
And I think that rather than say, I know what the plan is, say, we're prepared for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly when you're building in a space like AI, where the daily innovation and change is truly mind-boggling. Like it's overwhelming to read every day how much innovation is occurring. And so what I tell our team is not that we can plan for what's next, we can plan for the next innovation. It's just we are prepared for anything. We keep our head down and execute on our plan. I hired a really fantastic AI application engineer who's got a master's in AI application from Duke, which that's a program now. And he keeps me at the frontier of everything happening there. And so while I don't try to predict where AI is going because it's moving so fast, I actually just keep our structures and our strategy and our focus in place such that we can adapt to anything and be able to pivot. I think as it relates to the private markets industry, how it's changing, as I mentioned, more individual investors, but what remains to be seen is how that evolves, right? You have new structures like interval funds, which are slightly more liquid vehicles, almost like a mutual fund with private
Okay.
investments in them. So you're going to have some of that. I think we'll see what happens in the regulatory environment. For example, there was just in the last month a change for accredited investors and
Right.
how they get qualified. I mean, that has dramatic implications for the ability to market to these individuals. Because one thing we haven't mentioned is one of the reasons why private markets are opaque and challenging is you can't market them broadly. And so, by and large, it's a siloed data set where, the investor and the GP are the only people that communicate, right? And there are some, but at the end of the day, that investor, it's not like they can just go look online and ask a bunch of other investors in that fund what they think and stuff like that. So, it is a siloed world, but I do think some of these new structures are going to be interesting and innovative. But again, it doesn't resolve the complexity problem completely. So that'll be really interesting in the private markets. And obviously, lastly, tech. I mean, the tech is dramatically disrupting the private markets world. They call it wealth tech these days.
Uh-huh.
There are new startups every day, and there are new startups making access easier. There are new startups making tax compliance easier. Obviously, there are startups like mine, using AI to make portfolio management and due diligence management easier. And so, like I said, for us, rather than try to predict what's coming because it's moving so fast, I'm just trying to keep our team culture really focused on being adaptable and being flexible and understanding that, we can't control a lot of things, but we can control, building our product and focusing on, going where the puck's going in terms of AI. So that's really it. And, we just try to stay disciplined about that.
Yeah. How about just the benefits of living in a free market capitalist society? How has that
Sure.
benefited you in growing this business and all the things you've done?
Sure. I think growth, at least for me, I'm a very growth-minded person. I think growth is like oxygen,
Hmm.
and prosperity is oxygen in a way. And so I think for most people, they need that too. And so being able to have agency, being able to determine your outcomes, being able to build and better your life is really, to me, critical. And I think having a free market, free society is critical to that. And so, I'm an old school free markets guy, maybe a
Uh-huh.
Reaganite, so to speak, in those
Yes.
things. And to me, I think that's everything. Obviously, rule of law too. I mean, we wouldn't have the free market society we have if we didn't have a strong rule of law in our country. And I think we need to maintain that because I do think that at times is under threat. So to me, protecting that and showing people why prosperity is so important and how they can access that too. I'm married into a family of people who live the American dream.
Hmm.
My wife's family, they had to flee a country, Iran, that did fall, and that the government did fall, and people had to flee and come to seek a better life here and totally start over. And so I think that for us, these concepts can be abstract, but I see it every day, and have watched my family live the American dream, and so I'm very passionate about that.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
How about before we started recording, we were talking about political campaigns and that
Yeah,
a campaign really is like a startup. So
it
maybe
is.
talk a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So without getting into the nitty-gritty of politics, I did two presidential campaigns. I started running campaigns when I was in law school. Your third year of law school, as you know, is kind of a joke. And so
Yeah.
by my third year, I had left the legal world and decided I was going to go run campaigns. And so started with some state rep campaigns, then eventually ended up doing some presidential campaigns, and in between worked in the United States Senate. And they are absolutely startups. And I think the best startup training in the world is doing political campaigns. And for some reason, society doesn't think that. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is a multidisciplinary approach to thinking. And you know, I think that like a grounding in these other areas, when you can create those mental models that others don't have in your space, it's really
Hmm.
valuable. And so coming into startup world and coming into the business world, I just gained so much. I mean, marketing, I mean, you have no budget.
Right.
You've got a ton of media on you. It's all got to be earned media, by
Yes.
and large. And, you've got to create a brand. You've got to start telling a story. And also, campaigns are so mission driven.
Mm.
And I think that any startup has to be mission driven. At Unlimited, we are absolutely mission driven. I think at Legacy Night, when we launched, we're very mission driven. And so, to me, I think there's so many translatable skill sets from those two worlds. And I think people need to be open minded about these things, and I think ultimately, and this may be a strong opinion to some, but I think in the business world, I think in the legal world, I think that people they create these moats around their own careers by saying, you can't do what I do unless you did this.
Right.
And, you can't do finance unless you were an investment banker.
Hmm.
And, you can't be an investment banker unless you had a business degree. I'm probably one of the only guys working in finance with a Latin American history degree. But,
Uh-huh.
I think it's super valuable. And I can tell you that, when you see some of these government systems we're seeing today, there are a lot of similarities to some of the more populist leaders we saw in Latin America throughout the 20th century. So, bottom line is, I think that you should always look at your past experiences, and I actually think that the things that look a lot different than what you've been doing actually can create the easiest answers for you because everyone else that's trying to solve the same problem you are, they're using a very narrow mental model. Whereas if you have a multidisciplinary approach pulling from these other areas, it allows you to really think more broadly and answer these big problems. Because the reality is, the big problems today are not one discipline, right? They're
Right.
very complex. We have a very complex world. We have a complex economy. We have a complex political system. And I think that you have to look at it from a complex mindset in order to solve these problems or think about them clearly.
Yeah. How about any particular moment on any of those campaigns that just sticks out as just maybe it was super exciting and thrilling, or
Um,
it was really surprising? Just just some highlights of just to give people just a look on what it's like to be working on a presidential campaign or any of the campaigns.
sure. Um, I could tell you some funny stories, probably some I can't tell here. You know, I think that the day that we dropped out in 2016 is kind of an example. The senator I worked for got second in 2016, the Republican primary. That morning, I'm driving to the office, and I'm on the phone with a New York Times reporter who was asking me a pretty outlandish question about, something that President Trump had said at the time. And, I just, I'm talking to this reporter. It's kind of this crazy environment. And then, 30 minutes later, I get the call that we're actually going to drop out that night. And I need to be at the airport at the FBO and hop on this plane in 20 minutes, to be in Indianapolis in 3 hours or something, and it's just kind of a surreal moment. And then we hop on, we go there, it all happens. And that day you just think about it, what a crazy day. Okay, we didn't know, they'd kept that just at the real senior level. And just experiences like that are crazy. I'd say the funniest story, this is probably my 15 minutes of fame in politics, was when I was running. I ran a lot of the state campaigns in 16 for my candidate, and one of them was Maine. And I was doing the delegate strategy where you help pick the people, and we had won Maine pretty handily. And so every delegate counted at that point. And I didn't want to let the governor and his wife be delegates on our team because he was for one of the other candidates. And it's a long story, but bottom line, I landed. I was flying from Miami to Bangor, Maine, and I landed in LaGuardia in New York to change planes, and my phone just explodes. And apparently, unbeknownst to me, the governor had put out a press release attacking me, not my candidate, because all of his supporters like my candidate, but me. And he was mad at me for not letting his wife be a delegate. And so he put out a press release saying I betrayed the people of Maine. And so that
Oh my
was
word.
that was yeah that was my 15 minutes of fame, and pretty entertaining in hindsight. He was a character, and Maine politics and all New England politics is really entertaining and kind of colorful. And so in hindsight, I laugh about that. But as a general rule, as an operative, your goal is to stay out of the media. And so that was probably the one time I broke that. But I still get a lot of ribbing from my former colleagues about that day when the governor of Maine said I betrayed the people of Maine for not letting his wife be a delegate.
Oh God, that's hilarious.
Yeah. Um,
Oh wow. I mentioned I was a when Trump ran the first time, I was a Ted Cruz delegate to the
mhm.
Republican National Convention. And I remember being at a Ted Cruz event outside. He's speaking, and I'm filming it on my phone. And I mean, it was like a perfect political moment. As he's speaking, all of a sudden, this plane comes flying by super low, and it's so loud he has to stop talking and flies right over us. And it says Trump on the side of the plane, and then comes into land. And I think
Yeah.
you just kind of thought in the back of your head, well, it's all over now. This is like a sign, but I have it on video. I'm like, I couldn't believe it. It was like a scene out of a movie. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, look, I mean, the president he understands marketing, he understands
Yes,
optics, he understands positioning. I actually, I think policy wise, he and I are very aligned, but he is, I'd say, he's been a real disruptor and innovator as it relates to messaging and positioning. And, his team's done some things that I think have been really, disruptive and game changing to the overall media landscape that
for
probably in
sure.
some ways were healthy.
No, for
But
sure.
he's good at
Absolutely.
that. Yeah. So
Yes, he
unfortunately,
is.
I was on the receiving end
Yeah.
of many of those, but yeah, he's pretty good at it. So.
Oh, how about looking back, any particular decision or action you'd say has been most pivotal in your success so far?
You know, it's interesting. I think that agency is so important. And it occurred to me at one point, I think when I went to Legacy Night that, at CAS, I was a managing director, in politics, I was on the senior team, but, I wasn't running it, right? And I think when I got to Legacy Night one day, I had this real epiphany that, if you have an off day, your business takes an off day.
Uh-huh.
And at first that can be very daunting and it can be a little bit suffocating to think, wow, like this is all up to me. Um, and then once you embrace that and you embrace that your life and your outcomes are so within your control,
Hmm.
it's the most empowering thing imaginable. And I think what you want is this concept I really love about radical accountability. And
Yes.
if what you're doing, if your thing wins, everyone knows that you're the reason it won, or you and your team. Whereas, and if it fails, it's the same way, right?
Right.
Everyone knows why. But I think I'd rather live with radical accountability and high agency than the opposite. And so I think for people, you need to understand that like your life is within your control. And I talk to a lot of friends and people. I'm in my late 30s, and so I'm at that era where a lot of people, they're deciding whether they're going to keep working for the big company, whether they're going to go be their own person, or going to start
Yeah.
their own, company or whatever. And I find a lot of people they really have decision paralysis, and they really
Hmm.
grapple with it. And sometimes people make that jump at one point, and sometimes they don't. But for me, having done it a couple times now, it's I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean,
Uh-huh.
you having control over your life and having control over your outcomes is just so empowering. And I think that that's an important thing that people should always remember that, the best day to do it is today.
Right.
And so I'll touch on something because I know you're a marathon runner too.
Uh-huh.
I think that running and doing big things physically also is a great way to widen your aperture of what you're capable of.
For sure.
And so like I've always found that through physical training, you're able to really sharpen your mind. And to me, that's meditation, right? And
Hmm.
that's, going on a really long run. And so I think those things are really empowering. And so for people, I always think like doing hard things physically too.
Yes.
Say if you're, especially, when your professional career might not be going exactly how you want it to, finding achievement and finding ways to build up your confidence in other areas like that, I think can
Hmm.
be really valuable.
No, that's very, very good. How
Mhm.
about advice you give to like these entrepreneurs, like whether it's young aspiring entrepreneurs or people in their 30s, 40s looking to make the shift? Any advice you'd give to someone that's considering, taking the risk and taking
Sure.
agency on their own life and going off on their own?
Yeah, there are two concepts that I have learned, and I candidly have learned these at times the hard way. But I think that these concepts are critical if you're going to build. Number one is ego is the enemy.
Mm.
Obviously, there's a Ryan Holiday book about that. Ego can make you not see the world clearly. It can make you make bad decisions. I think everyone needs to have confidence, right? But confidence comes through competence, and competence comes through hard work and achievement. And so I think that avoiding ego as best you can and thinking clearly and checking yourself and asking yourself, am I making this decision out of ego or am I making this decision because it's a good decision?
Right.
I think if you actually go through your mental models in advance of these, you can avoid a lot of really bad decisions. And when I look at some of the worst decisions I've made, as an investor, as a professional, a lot of them were because I didn't go through that list and I made an investment because I thought it was shiny and thought it was prestigious, or I wanted to be, investing with these other people that I really
Hmm.
respected or whatever it may be. But a lot of those times, those things are driven by ego. And then the other one, and I really love this one, it's no cherished outcomes.
Mm.
And I think that that's one of our core values. Both of those are core values of ours at Unlimited. But if you if you look at the outcomes and you're building towards an outcome, which in a startup is hard not to do, you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to have this big exit and going
Hmm.
to have this massive liquidity event or whatever it may be. Ultimately that's not, it's about the process and it's about how you build. And I think that you have to stay disciplined with what's right in front of you every day. You just have to build and embrace the process, enjoy the process, right? That's the fun. And to me, building a company is one of the best creative expressions in the world.
Yes.
And so I think that cherishing the process and not the outcomes is critical. I think that for us one time at Legacy Night early on, a big lesson we learned was, our goal when we started was let's get to $1 billion in AUM. That's kind of the threshold for, okay, you're like an established, legitimate firm. And, this was also 2020 and 21. So we had a little bit of a bump. So that being
Uh-huh.
said, we hit it in like 3 years. And which is a really impressive growth. We got named the fastest growing RIA in Texas during that time. But the reality is once we hit that, it was kind of like, well, what now?
Right.
Because we cherished that outcome, and we cherished, these big outcomes of what we wanted to be and how it was going to impact our lives. And we didn't really think about the process and enjoy that as much. And in hindsight, I think that harmed us when things did get a little harder and we kind of passed those goals that we thought were so cherished, and we kind of didn't really know what to do. And so I think at Unlimited, I really try to not focus on big. I think it's important to have goals, to be clear, and I think you need
Uh-huh.
to have KPIs, you need to have metrics. But I think although you should be aware of the big picture goals, and at Limited, we're an ambitious company for sure, but we don't cherish them, right? We don't
Hmm.
we don't say if we don't get there, I'm going to be miserable, because so much about life and expectation. It's so much about your expectation, your anticipation of something, rather than the actual event, right? And
For
so
sure.
I think if you try to block out, these big outcomes that everyone else does, and you just focus on executing and focus on building what you can as best you can, then ultimately I think that you're going to get there anyway. But not being anchored to that, I think, is really helpful as you build.
Yeah. No, yeah. Yeah. And to take that back to the marathon analogy or
Hmm.
triathlons, it's the training
Yeah.
that's the fun part. It's not even the event. And people always ask when they're gonna do their first marathon or triathlon, what time should I shoot for?
Hmm.
I'm like, you'll never get your first marathon ever again. So just enjoy it and don't
That's
worry about
right.
your time. Just do it. And then on the next one, you can try to beat your first time or whatever. But like, just you never get the first time ever again.
Right.
And
And,
just
I think with a marathon, using that as an analogy, because I think it's so helpful, is, that's not to say you don't have a goal time. And that's not
right.
to say that you aren't going to give it your best. I think you should, but doing your best to achieve an outcome versus doing your best because that's what you're capable of, and
Yes.
that's what you've worked hard for if you put in the work, I think that you have to stay focused on that.
Yeah.
And totally, yeah. So I'm not saying, hey, don't worry about your time, don't worry about how you compete. It's not that. I think it's just not anchoring your identity and anchoring your experience to an outcome, I think is really critical.
Yeah. And there's something about those individual sports where you're competing against yourself,
Hmm.
similar to business, and to tune out, what's the world doing? It's like I want to I want to I want to be in optimum performance here. And the next time around, I want to do even better than I did before. But you're competing
Right.
against yourself because there will always be people faster than you. There'll always be people slower than you. There'll always be people with more money, less money.
Sure.
But like you're competing against yourself and trying to, you know, operate at that optimal level for yourself and keep pushing that up and turning up the dial.
Yeah, I always tell my team and my kids too, you know, don't worry about what other people are doing, but until you're being the best version of yourself and you're achieving your potential, which of course we never will.
Right.
Don't worry about what other people are doing, because until you're at your best and you're your optimal self, then really you don't have enough time to be focused on those other things. So I think that keeps me grounded. I mean, no one's perfect about it, right? We
Right.
see what's happening in the world and we're competitive and ambitious, but that being said, just focusing on being, the best version of your authentic self every day, I think is my goal at least.
Yeah, for sure. How about, and maybe it's too early to ask this, but just legacy. How do you think about, working to build a lasting legacy through your
Sure.
business ventures?
No, this is an interesting topic. When I was young, I wanted to be a senator and all those things. I thought that, legacy and having your picture on a wall was ultimately what was the most important thing. And, over time, I've really realized that's not. And I think, unfortunately, you see that through, this isn't necessarily people I've worked for. I've just seen others where, they're a great CEO, they're a very prominent elected official, whatever. They're divorced 3 times,
Right.
their kids don't speak to them, they don't. And so for me, I think that I think having a balanced life and being great, across what you do is important. But to me, if you're a really successful business person and you're a real bit bad failure as a husband and a father,
Mm,
then ultimately, and a community person, you're not winning, right? And so I just stopped admiring people like that. And so I think legacy to me is ultimately, candidly, it's my kids. That's it.
yes.
In 2 generations, no one's going to remember me anyway.
Right.
And so
Yes.
I literally just think that, the way my kids view me and the way my spouse and my family view me ultimately is what's most important. And there's a certain like nihilism that comes with that at times, but also it's deeply humbling. If you
Oh,
if you think
yes.
about it, when you realize like none of this matters, I mean, think about the number of senators there have been in the last 100 years, and how many of them are totally lost to history, except for maybe a couple volumes or a picture in a hallway somewhere in a cavernous, basement at the Capitol.
Right.
So, no one cares. And now, do their families remember them? Yes,
Uh-huh.
for better or worse. And so, as I get older, I think more and more about that. And I also think that, going back to no cherished outcomes, when you don't anchor your legacy to some huge outcome and you just
Yes.
say like I want to do meaningful things and solve meaningful problems and do it with great people. I think that you're going to end up achieving big things. But again, you can't just focus on how that looks for you, because again, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah. How about success? What's your personal definition of success? And you can take that any direction
Yeah.
you want.
I really do think it's being the best version of your authentic self.
Mm.
And obviously, every day you're not going to be that, but know what you're capable of, and ultimately try to be that every day. I think that we all fall short, but that's why every day is a process, right? And just try to get better each day. I think processes and systems are super important to get there. But I think knowing what you're capable of, and we're all capable of so much, right? But knowing what you're capable of and knowing what you can achieve, and not just achieve, but knowing what you can be in the world. It's not just about achievement. It's also about, how you impact others, right? And relationships. And so I think that trying to be the best version of yourself, your authentic self, be who you really are and who you
Hmm.
should be, which I think for men in particular is a real
Uh,
challenge.
right.
I think in the world we live in today, I want to try to be that. And ultimately, the older I get, the more I want to be around other people that way.
Yeah.
I just think life's too short to posture and, be clever and not kind. I really just kind of lose patience with that every day.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not perfect at it either. I don't want to suggest that, but I think that ultimately that's sort of the North Star.
Yeah. Why do you think it is so hard for men to be their authentic selves?
I think our society's created a lot of expectations of men that are unfortunate. And I think that's why we're seeing such a crisis today amongst a lot of younger men, because of their identities and their egos and the things that they think that they have to be. And like I said, I'm very encouraged though. I think there are a lot of great leaders out there today who are leading the right way, who have inspired me,
Uh-huh.
and they are their authentic self. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be sincere, to tell people how much they mean to you,
Right.
to encourage them, to not view them as your competition. Like I said, I mean, to me, I think one of the greatest joys in the world is seeing someone that is great, being their authentic self and succeeding and living their dreams. And I hate that so many people tear others down,
Uh-huh.
for all those reasons. And obviously they do that because of things that are internal to them and
Right.
their insecurities and whatnot. But um, yeah, I really do think that a lot of men um, they struggle with that, and they struggle with having the courage to be who they want to be, just because they don't. But that's why I think that the more we can be ourselves, and the more that we can be that, the more that others will see that and say it's okay for me to be. And like I
Yeah.
said, I'm very lucky and grateful to have had so many good role models that I've watched do that.
Yeah. It makes such a difference
Mhm.
having role models and then now going
Yeah.
and trying to be a role model and just, and we just always talk like in some of the groups I'm in my family, it's like things are caught, not taught. It's like people are watching your kids, family, people you work with, they're watching what you do, not necessarily just what you say. It's like, what are people actually doing to model the right behavior and model ethics and morals and a good culture and strong core values? And it's so much more than words. It's actions.
Totally. And I'll also say this, one of the great things, one of the reasons I really love podcasts and things like this, what you're doing is great work. No one has an excuse anymore to not be informed.
Right.
And,
Right.
50 years ago, you had your community, you had the men in your house, the around you was speaking specifically about men, but it's everybody. And today, that's not the case. I mean, some of the best leadership lessons, business lessons, startup lessons, character values lessons I've ever gotten have been from podcasts and books. I'm a
Yes.
voracious reader, and I
100%.
mean, it's all at your fingertips today with the internet and with podcasts. And so, I mean, to me, like the reason I love the podcast format so much is it's a long form way to really dig in and learn and hear from somebody. I mean, imagine 50 years ago if you got to say, hey, you can have the CEO of JP Morgan or ExxonMobil or whatever, I mean, great
Yes.
startups, great venture investors, and you could sit down and listen to them talk about their process and their
Yes.
strategies for 2 hours. I mean, what a treasure trove, right?
Totally.
And so I think today I tell people like, there's no excuse not to be informed and not be educated about how to be better and
Yeah.
how to do these things. And so I think for that reason, we should all be better. And ultimately, if, that'll make the world better if we're all informed and educated on all the great things out there.
No, absolutely. All right, last question.
Sure.
And this just popped into my head as we're talking. Do you have a favorite book that you've read? It could be fiction, nonfiction, business, not business related, but a
Sure.
favorite book that really you've learned a lot from?
You know, I think in terms of thinking, it's got to be Poor Charlie's Almanac.
Mm.
Charlie Munger. I'm a Munger head. I think
Uh-huh.
Charlie Munger was just absolutely brilliant. Total multidisciplinary approach. He was such a good thinker. And everyone obviously gives Warren Buffett, a lot of the
Uh-huh.
notoriety and credit for what Berkshire Hathaway has done. But I think Charlie Munger was just as critical to the success of Berkshire, and of course Buffett would say that too. So I think Poor Charlie's Almanac, and I'll say also the Collison brothers started Stripe Press recently at Stripe, and they just published a new version of it, which is fantastic.
Uh-huh.
So I'd say that. I think in business books, the last one I'll say is I think Good to Great is
Yes. Yeah.
is just absolutely wonderful. I
Yeah.
think that's a very powerful book.
No, that's awesome. Well, good. Well, David, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you
Absolutely.
coming on the show and sharing your wisdom. So thank you so very much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Yeah, and we'll share on the show notes,
Okay.
stuff way people can get in touch with you, Unlimited AI, and so forth. But again, thank you so very much. Thank you for
Absolutely.
sharing your
My
authentic
pleasure.
self with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.